So this is the eighth film in the Rethinking Existentialism series. And this film is about Frantz Fanon. I'm going to talk about his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, that he published in 1952. This is a remarkable work, a very eclectic piece of writing in which he approaches the problems that he sees generated by colonialism and by racism um, through a series of critical analyses of various writings on this topic, but writings that are of very different kinds. So he writes about novels, he writes about plays, he writes about classic works of Western philosophy, he writes about classic works of psychoanalysis, and he writes about some, at the time, highly influential works of anthropology. And he does this as well through a varying writing style that is itself, in many ways, quite eclectic. So there are passages of the book that are written in the kind of detached, third-personal, objective, analytical prose that you expect to find in academic work, and there are other parts that are written in the more kind of subjective, confessional, autobiographical, almost meditative style, which is has been characteristic of some works of philosophy, in French philosophy in particular, but isn't what we tend to expect from 20th century um, uh, uh, academic work. Um, and at the same time, I mean, there are times when he's writing in a very kind of lyrical, poetic, impassioned style, and there are other times where, as I say, he's very detached and dry and analytical. Um, and that eclecticism itself, I think, makes the book quite a challenging read. It's not always clear how these different ideas that are presented in those very different styles are supposed to fit together. Um, I think it's a result of that eclecticism that there's a fairly widespread reading of the book, um, which is very influenced by the literary and cultural critic Homi Bhabha, who describes it as a desperate, doomed search for deliverance from the problems of racism. So it's that idea that it's a desperate and doomed search that crops up in different ways again and again in writing about this book. Um, uh, and I think what's meant by that is this idea that what Fanon is up to is trying to show that the problems of racism have multiple sources, uh, multiple contrary sources that in the sense that those sources, what ways of addressing some of those sources will impede the overcoming of other aspects of the problem, and that there is no kind of single unified way to understand this, and that some of these problems simply won't be or can't be overcome, at least can't be overcome simply by kind of philosophical thought and analysis. I think that's the idea of it being desperate and doomed, a kind of a sequence of false starts and failures that together bring out the kind of deeper problem that can only really be understood by trying and failing to solve it in various ways using the tools of the culture that are available, both literary, poetic, and fictional ways of approaching it, and also kind of psychoanalytic, philosophical, and anthropological ways of approaching it. But I actually think that kind of postmodern reading of Black Skin, White Masks is mistaken. I think that underneath the kind of eclecticism, the fragmentation, the variable style of Black Skin, White Masks is a single line of argument, a single logic, which not only develops across the book, building towards its own conclusion, but itself justifies the eclecticism. And that is that it's an argument for existentialism, right? It's an argument that existence precedes essence, that there are no true ethnic essences, and that there are no, in fact, fixed properties of the individual, no fixed personality, there is no fixed essence or nature of an individual, or of any group of individuals, and that includes ethnic groups, or of the whole human race together. There's no human nature. I think that's classic kind of existentialist view, is Fanon's view, and it's the view that he's arguing for throughout the book. So he says, for example, at the end, the black man is not no more than the white man. Right? And that just sums up his idea that there is no kind of essence to being a black man in his language, or a white man. I'm endlessly creating myself, he says. That is the classic existentialist view, that to be a human being is to be kind of a creature whose essence is only determined by their own projects, their own creativity, the values and goals and aims that they choose. And I think Fanon wants to argue for this. Well, I think he argues for it because he thinks it's true, but I think he also thinks that understanding that truth about human beings is essential to two things. One is overcoming racism itself, because I think he sees racism as a kind of essentialism, as a kind of view that well, he does see racism as a kind of essentialism, as a view that different ethnic groups have different essential properties, so that if you are a white man in his language, or a black man, then as a result of that you have certain properties, certain qualities just are true of you and are fixed, and there's nothing that you can do about them, and they influence your behaviour in various ways. He thinks that essentialism about ethnicity or about race is at the core of racism. But he also thinks that it's at the core of some psychiatric problems that people can suffer, some forms of distress, some forms of anxiety and despair that people can suffer as a result of racism. So there's a therapeutic line of argument here, as well as a kind of wider political line of argument. And the therapeutic line of argument is that coming to understand the truth, the existentialist truth, should help to overcome the distress that's caused by racism on an individual level, and on a wider social level. If we were to come to see the world correctly, then there would not be any racism. In fact, there would not be any idea of race at all, of Fanon's view. So if he's an existentialist, and he thinks there's no such thing as fixed properties of an individual, no fixed essence, no nature, and as a result, no essential characteristics of any group of people, that's not all there is to his existentialism, right? I think there's another important dimension of it. So as I said, he sees his role here as partly therapeutic, right? I mean, one thing that should never be forgotten about Frantz Fanon is that, as well as a philosopher and a political theorist, he was a psychiatrist, a practicing psychiatrist. In fact, he first drafted Black Skin, White Masks as a dissertation for his medical degree that he was studying at the University of Lyon in Paris. But his supervisors suggested that perhaps such an unusual work might not be appreciated by the examiners, so he wrote a different dissertation instead on a much more straightforwardly and obviously medical topic, and passed with flying colours, and then published Black Skin, White Masks as a book instead. The therapeutic aim of the book is, although he thinks that racism causes problems for everybody, he's particularly focused in this book on the problems it causes for black people, and particularly he's focused on the problems it causes for black men. He says the black man suffers in his body in a way very different to the way the white man does. Okay, so he thinks that there are specific forms of distress, specific problems that are faced as a result of racism by black people. But then you need to ask, well, how can there be specific forms of distress faced by a particular group of people if there are no essential characteristics of that group of people? Right? What is it that marks out that group of people as people who might face a particular kind of problem, a particular kind of psychological problem, if it's not an essential characteristic of that group of people that marks them out as such, right? Why does this problem only affect some people, not others, if there are no essential characteristics, no fixed characteristics that distinguish those groups of people from one another? And that his answer to that is that the problem is caused by racism, right? It's by colonialism. In fact, is how he sees all this, because he's writing in the context of French colonial power. So he thinks that the construction of race, the idea that there are races, is not simply the false idea that some groups of people have essential characteristics that other groups don't have. It's not just about difference, but it's about superiority and inferiority, right? And that's because it's a result of colonialism. So he thinks that the colonial powers have presented themselves as superior to the colonized people, and the colonized people as inferior, right? And that this idea of superiority and inferiority has been spread throughout the shared culture, what Fanon calls the collective unconscious. So this is a case of him appropriating terminology from somebody else. So he's taken Carl Jung's idea of the shared unconscious, or the collective unconscious. But he's very clear that he says that he doesn't agree with Jung's view that this is an innate, internal, invariable structure of the mind. It's not at all, he says. It's just our common culture. It's cultural media. Right? That's the shared unconscious. It's the fact that white children and black children in the French colonies at the time are raised on the same storybooks and on the same films and on the same comics. And those stories and films and comics all have white heroes, right? Not black heroes. So the kind of superiority of the hero becomes associated with whiteness. And black people are either absent entirely from these stories, invisible, or they're presented in ways that are demeaning or belittling, or in other ways to try to kind of that embody the idea that black people are inferior to white people. And it's because both groups of children are raised on the same stories that, in a sense, they have the same outlook, right? But of course, in another sense, it's a different outlook because the white children are identified by society with white people, and the black children are identified by their wider society with black people. And so the white children grow up to be identified with the superior group of people, and the black people grow up to be identified with a group of people which they themselves have imbibed the idea are, from their upbringing, from the shared culture, are inferior, and that this kind of sense of superiority and inferiority that it gets kind of embedded in our outlook through our childhood, says Fanon, is what causes particular problems. It causes a lot of problems, but it's going to cause different kinds of problems depending on whether you yourself are white or black, right? And that's his kind of psychiatric theory. So not only is this a form of existentialism, but clearly it's a form of existentialism that incorporates the idea of sedimentation, right? I've talked in earlier films about the difference between Sartre and Beauvoir on existentialism. Sartre's initial form of existentialism resting on this idea of radical freedom, so that any values or projects that you have can be easily overthrown or removed, whereas Beauvoir thinks that no values become sedimented into your outlook. They become quietly influential over your cognition and over your behavior in ways that you don't even notice, in ways that you might not endorse, and in ways that are very difficult to overcome if you do notice and you want to overcome them. I think Fanon's view is similar to Beauvoir's in that way. He thinks that, again, through upbringing in particular, but also then it's reinforced in the wider culture in adult life, this idea of superiority and inferiority is slowly sedimented into people's outlooks, so that even though they might reject it when they are adults, when they are in an autobiographical moment, he tells us about himself. He's a qualified doctor. He's an experienced soldier. He's had lots of achievements in his adult life, and yet still it doesn't take much to trigger this overwhelming sense of inferiority in him as a result of this kind of sedimented view of inferiority and superiority. The similarity here with Beauvoir has led some commentators, I think, to accuse Fanon of a kind of sexism where he's been influenced by Beauvoir, but he doesn't mention that because she's not mentioned anywhere in the book. I'm not so sure. I wouldn't be so quick to make that accusation. It may simply be that Beauvoir and Fanon have common influences here, or that they've just come to the same picture because they're analysing relatively similar or similar enough phenomena. But however it came about, the similarity there, I think, is certainly enough to suggest that Fanon's work should be classified as a form of existentialism, a canonical form of existentialism, alongside The Second Sex, and alongside Sartre's book Saint-Genet, which is also published in 1952, at the same time pretty much as Black Skin, White Masks, which also endorses this idea of existentialism based on sedimentation. So to return to the Homi Bhabha says, so at the end of Black Skin, White Masks, right, Fanon talks about trying to overcome the whole idea of race. He thinks the whole idea of race has just been an exercise in colonial power. It's caused a huge amount of problems. It continues to cause a huge amount of problems, and that the way forwards is to overcome it and to see the world in the correct existentialist way. Homi Bhabha, who thinks that the book is really a desperate, doomed search for deliverance, right? A series of false starts and failures. He describes that last section of the book as a banal moral coda that fails to live up to the deep insights of the rest of the book. Whereas I don't think that's right at all. I think that, in fact, that end section of the book where he argues for overcoming the idea of race entirely is exactly what he has been consistently arguing for all the way through the book. It is the existentialist theory that he supports through all of the analyses all the way through.